Today we are going to talk about the future directions of the daylight standard. It has been in force since 2018. So what have we learned so far with the standard, and where do we want it to go next? So this is probably a recap for some of you, but just to set the stage, the European standard is the first unified standard for daylight in Europe, and it applies to all building types. And it is supposed to replace a patchwork of national standards that's used across the EU. There's 4 criteria in the standard, and today we will only focus on the daylight provision criteria. In the standard, there's 2 methods to comply with the recommendations. Method 1 is the daylight factor method, and method 2 is a climate-based method, very similar to the spatial daylight autonomy as we know it from the American LM83. The only exception is that in the European standard, we use 50% of the daylight hours instead of a fixed time period. So the minimum recommended level in the standard is 300 lux for 50% of the area and 100 lux for 95% of the area. And of course, the compliance calculation should include a number of items as we usually do when we do daylight calculations. So for the past 3 years, we have been running this preliminary work item. And here the committee has collected comments from the national standardization bodies. We have reviewed national building codes and certification schemes. We have, of course, read the pre-existing published studies, and we have also gathered some informal industry feedback. And lastly, we had also initiated some studies ourselves to spread light of some of the things that we have been discussing within the daylight provision. So, based on this work, we have identified some challenges in the current standard. First of all, we can see there's different ways of doing calculations according to the method 2. So we want to clarify this in the standard. Then there's also something about the ambition level for the daylight provision and integration with national building codes and voluntary building certification scheme. And these 3 middle points is what we will deep dive into in this presentation. And then lastly, we can also see that especially for the climate-based calculation method, there's still some complexity that can make it very difficult for practitioners to use this method. So with this, I'll hand over the words to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Helle. So when I first got word of the European standard, I always thought of it maybe as a best practice. But when it was released in 2018, I was really quite struck by how many of the national code authorities were interested in referencing it. So I guess we have to think, is it a best practice or is it a lowest permissible amount? So if we take the idea of lowest permissible amount, most EU countries have not implemented the standard or have it approved, but it's not binding. So it's not really a part of the building code that you can get by without it. I really wish we had a map of that, actually, but Finland comes to mind as one of the non-binding. Other countries have referenced it, but perhaps modified it a bit, and of course the UK annex, so for multifamily housing, there's a reduced requirement there. The proposed Icelandic building code, I believe it has a lower area fraction, so slight modifications there. Now, the 2 standout examples that I can think of where the standard has been applied more or less as intended, you've got the Danish building codes from BR18, so around the time of the release of the standard. But it is just the target illuminance value. It doesn't take daylight factor, but the illuminance method. But it's just the target, it's not the minimum target. So it's, we'll say it took part of it. And then the Swedish workplace safety from 2020 is when it got revised. And it's a nice bit of legislation. I quite admire it. And it references exactly the European standard. The market uptake of that, there's not so many that are unfortunately that are aware of that. We do that as a standard for office buildings and other workplaces, but in practice, many of our contemporaries within Sweden aren't using that. They're reverting to the code. Right, so certification. So now we go over to the what we call the best practice. Many of you are familiar with these. I won't go into depth. We have on the lead, we do have a Nordic path where you can, if you're over 50 degrees latitude, you can use the European standard. I would like to tell you a little bit of story. We have different degrees of integration here. Quite often they are modified though, so you have, say, 40% of the building to fulfill the European standard. So is it with BREEAM and LEED. But I would like to tell you a quick story about the Miljobygg. Now this was a really environmental building is what it's called in Sweden, and has a huge market share, particularly for multifamily residential. We updated to version 3. It was deemed the European standard was too new, but with version 4, the committee was very interested in working with that. But because there are a lot of multifamily residential, when we started to explain to them in their first draft, they tried to take it directly off the shelf, and it's a mandatory credit. So we started to try to explain to them that it would be difficult. They would lose a lot of projects. So the whole daylight aspect there got dumped. It's quite unfortunate. And with Svanen now, same market, I do feel that there's probably the same trend there. They would have liked to have taken it right off the shelf, but because they couldn't, then maybe it was a bit difficult. But different types of modification is what I'm trying to say here. So we've commissioned a fair amount of studies. We had questions we wanted answered. So you see a list of them there. I won't go into them. Nico, you are presenting a couple of these studies in just a few minutes. Some so from Lund University and then the Danish Technological. You have been involved in a majority of them, and I believe one's being presented later today in this seminar. Yeah. Now, here we have at TU Delft and NTNU, the Norwegian University, 2 studies which we haven't commissioned, but we feel that they were quite relevant for the questions we were asking. It's like a pre-prepared answer to the questions we had. So somebody had the question before we did. Next one. So you can refer to our slides later. We won't go into detail in all of this, so it gives you just a rough overview. Go ahead on the next one. So, just to summarize, we compared to national building legislations. Quite often we found that there was maybe simplified methods that were sort of taking precedent over the European standard. We've compared it to LM83. Did you want to say a quick?
Yeah, so for the LM83, of course, we have these different time periods that we are considering, but what we could see when doing the comparison was that the European standard was slightly harder to meet. So you can say that the European standard is slightly more strict than the LM83.
Right, and then the compliance rate, the tiered combination of illuminance method and area fraction. So we did some tests varying that, and that's, again, Nico, you're going to explain a lot about that. One of the interesting things that we like to base this on was the idea of user satisfaction. We can't lose track of that. Then the combination of illuminance threshold and minimum level, the ETM, the minimum target. In fact, it's found that in many cases, the minimum target, everybody sort of seems to focus on the target threshold, but the minimum target over 95% of the area, in many cases, it depends on the architecture, but is more of a challenge. So just how these two relate to one another was something we're still trying to get an exact idea with. And then, of course, roof lights, one of my great passions in life. It maybe is a bit underrepresented in the European standard of how to deal with them. And then, of course, the performance for different climates, from Spain to Sweden, it's quite different. You don't need me to tell you that. Yeah. Do you want to take the next one?
So if you should try to sum up what we have found by initiating these studies, we can say that all it seems like the recommended levels for daylight provision is too strict. We can see that it's modified in the legislation, also in the voluntary certification schemes, and it is particularly difficult to meet in multifamily residential buildings. and also in urban context. What we can also see, and that's one of the studies that's presented later, is that occupant perceptions, they actually favor larger daylight areas over higher illuminance. So maybe we need another formulation of the criteria. And the results also indicate that if we have this high level of daylight, we might conflict with the energy and thermal comfort.
At the higher
levels, of course, not at the minimum level, but at the higher levels. And you can say that what we also found was that the ambition levels between the two methods, between the daylight factor and the climate-based, they don't really correspond to each other. There's also a difference there. And then lastly, we could also see when we compared the daylight provision criteria to the other criteria in the standard, that it's not really aligned. And just to show you what I mean by that is, this is just a sketch to say, okay, how are the different criteria in the current standard? So one of the things that we are looking at is really to see if we can align the criteria more. So we are looking at maybe introducing a fourth level instead of only having 3, and also maybe see what we can do so that the levels get more aligned.
Yeah, the idea that maybe this is towards best practice somewhere in here, and somewhere in here was more your minimum requirement.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, so the revision process is actually going to start shortly. We are going to activate the actual work item, and that means that within in the middle of next year, if everything goes as planned, we will actually be able to have a pre-standard out for inquiry. And then we would of course like to have all your comments. We would also like to have all your comments now. So let's have a discussion in the break. Let us hear what you think about it. So thank you.
A tight timeline, but we're
thank
optimistic.
You for listening.
Yeah, thank you.